Hello, everybody, and welcome to my final compendium for the Social Justice and Human Rights program. My name is Cerez, and I will be taking the time out today to guide you through the components of my final compendium. So to begin, we are going to just see a brief introduction on the home page that goes over just the contents of what to expect when moving through the Google Sites through each section of my compendium. Right now, there is about 5 sections. The first is storytelling, the next is traditions, the next one is a section called Two Journeys, and then the next one is generational trauma, and the final one is healing. Moving through each of these sections, you're going to see a timeline of events of how colonization has impacted Indigenous people from the beginnings of when the Spanish conquistadors landed on the Americas to where we are right now in our modern day society. Beginning with the first section, we're going to see the storytelling aspect. And this is probably one of the most important parts to me personally in this entire compendium. It is comprised of 3 different personal anecdotes regarding people that 2 of which are people that I know personally. And the third is an article that I found on NPR's website where these people have lived experience living through boarding schools. I touch on the notion in the beginning of this section that I am currently 30 years old at the time of recording this in 2023, and my youngest sibling in my family is 19, and I have 4 siblings, 4 of us total, and we are the first generation in our family that has not been to boarding school. That is why I think this section is so important to realize, because boarding school is not history. Colonization is not a thing of the past. These issues that we see manifesting today within Indigenous cultures all around us, they are lived history. They are not some far off distant memory of the past. This is lived. This is where we are right now. So moving on from the storytelling aspect of my final compendium, we start with tradition. And this is also a very important aspect to understanding the rest of the compendium, because it is so important to start with a baseline understanding of how tribal nations operated traditionally prior to the onset of colonization and the onset of the Spanish conquistadors that arrived in the Americas in the late 1400s, early 1500s. In this section, we discuss things such as raising children, marriage values, LGBTQ plus or Two-Spirit plus people. We discuss different values, spiritual values, language that tribes use and their significance for the community and their significance as a whole within the community. Everything is interconnected. Every experience, every ceremony, every practice, every rule, there is a spiritual significance there. And it is so, so, so important to understand the impact of what colonization brought to Indigenous people, because the societies that they were living in at the time were so widely different than what we see today. And that's because of a direct result of colonization destroying indigenous cultures. Under this section, we also evaluate how European cultures and beliefs were at this time. I discuss some of the common knowledge regarding religion, marital roles, gender roles, child rearing, but I also touch on an important factor to remember when it comes to reading through the rest of this compendium, and that is the fact that no matter what viewpoint Europeans, Anglo-Saxons, the Spanish, whomever, no matter what viewpoint they view history as, or what lens they view history through, they are always going to see themselves as the victim. They will find fault in any other nation or civilization or race before they realize either their own faults or their own contributions to how society is playing out. This is an important aspect to remember because we will delve into more of theories relating to how Europeans interacted with indigenous people, policies and legislations, and having that understanding of just a general victim mindset within European communities and colonial communities will help make sense of these theories moving forward. And next we see, as we move through the compendium, the third section, which is the two journeys section. In this section, I separate the action of colonization into two parts. The first part is just colonization itself, and that's from when the Spaniards arrived in the Caribbean areas of North America and the horrendous violence that ensued the minute that they touched down. This section does contain a lot of content that could be distressing to some readers. So along with this video tour of my compendium, I will also include in this section a content warning for those who may be sensitive to these types of topics moving forward. There are a couple of content warnings throughout the entirety of the compendium because there are topics such as murder and sexual assault, suicide, and just abject violence in general. So let it be known to whomever is reading this final compendium and taking in all the information that I have to present that there may be distressing elements as you continue to read. Moving on, in the colonization aspect of this section, the two journeys section, we start with the Spanish, as I've said, and we see how things begin to evolve as time goes on from when the Spanish touch down to kind of this gray area point where I split the two timelines. We discuss in this section the violence and also the impact religion had on early conquistadors settling into tribal nations in North America in general. For the next section, I labeled it A New World because we see the change here. We see the movement from colonizer to settler colonialism, where people have become more settled and are making encampments and cities and towns within North America, establishing a government and really opening up a new dialogue on how to address what is known as the Indian problem. We see a lot of legislative changes in this section where we notice that the government, the newly developed government, is implementing a lot of laws and policies and treaties to try and help Indigenous communities. This plays an important role moving forward, and it's an important aspect to remember, this helping aspect that early settler colonialists attempted to do in order to rectify what had been done to Indigenous communities. Within this section, we also establish a basis of some of the actions that were committed against Indigenous people during this time that weren't necessarily related to a piece of legislation. There may have been one that was attached later on or as a result of these things that occurred. But this section will particularly discuss the elements of exploitation and the elements of assimilation, all under the roof of how institutions exploited Indigenous people. It's a very interesting section because it really ties into the next section that we'll be discussing. And there are important elements that are mentioned there that directly tie into the root cause of generational trauma, aside from just the colonization in general. And this section details a lot of measures that were taken not only on an individual level, but an institution-wide level, where the institution may not have been the government, but it was agencies or it was individual practitioners and things of that nature. So moving on with all that in mind, there's also an analysis in this section that involves some critical philosophical understanding of Giorgio Agamben's Homo Sacer. That is a common theory that is utilized within the social justice and human rights program. I take these two elements of early colonization and a new world and the exploitations that occurred on more of a micro level and explain how it plays into Giorgio Agamben's concept of Homo Sacer, in which bios and zoe exist. In the realm of colonists versus Indigenous people, colonists in this sense are the bios, and they have created a state of exception where the Indigenous population is seen as the Zoe, and they are the outcasts, and they are determined to be the ones that will be eradicated in some form or another. This section also takes a look at the biopower and biopolitic aspect of Michael Foucault's concept that he added on to Giorgio Agamben's Homo Sacer. We will delve into each of these terms more succinctly within this section, but it's just something that you can expect when reading through it. I will also be analyzing the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and emphasizing which rights were violated at an early point within colonization history. I also make the argument that although these rules may not have been implemented early on until hundreds of years later, they still applied. They just only applied to the colonizers. They expected this level of respect and human rights and dignity within themselves and their communities, but they did not extend that same right to the indigenous people that were living in the Americas before their arrival. Moving on from this section, we will see the second to last section, which is generational trauma. This section is one that ties together everything that we have learned thus far. Generational trauma and how it manifests in today's Indigenous societies are the key focal point for this section. We will discuss things such as childhood trauma, substance abuse, the missing and murdered Indigenous women and people movement, the gender violence and sexual assault that has become rampant within many Indigenous communities. And we will also discuss the rampant epidemic of suicides amongst Indigenous people within North America. There's also an important element to this section that ties into each of those individual talking points that I mentioned, and that is the theories that I present initially, where a lot of what has occurred throughout history for and against Indigenous people is done under the guise of humanitarianism. This theory, in a sense, recognizes that while there were people who did try to do good and tried to have good intentions with helping Indigenous people, they ended up falling into the irony of white paternalism, which is what I will explain further in this section, that basically encompasses the fact that no matter what they tried to do and what good intentions they may have had, they still furthered colonization against Native Americans. The other theory that I will be presenting in this section and how it ties into humanitarianism as a whole is the idea that Native Americans or any Indigenous people to North America were the first refugees of the West. They were displaced from their homes. They were stripped of their nationality. They were rendered stateless by a series of amendments and laws and regulations. They were persecuted. They were murdered at the hands of an oppressive regime. And they did not have the right to flee and seek asylum in another country. They were stuck. And they were stuck in their refugee status. And even into this day, we see elements of that refugeeism from early on in early colonialism. So as we go through each of those sections, it's important to remember what we have learned from the past areas and the past sections throughout this compendium involving legislation and how the basis of the majority of legislation were advocates and activists fighting for Indigenous rights within the U.S. government, and ultimately having it backfire on Indigenous people while furthering colonial interests. Finally, in this compendium, we reach the end where we have discussed traditions. We have seen how those traditions have changed and morphed and devolved with the destruction of the marriage, family, cultural unit within Indigenous people. And we see how things have begun to manifest in our current day, in our current reality. And we have an understanding of why Indigenous cultures are experiencing what they're experiencing in modern day. We also have an understanding of how things have begun when the Spanish initially came. We have an understanding of the idea that people have lived this experience and are continuing to live. These people have not lived it and then passed. They are currently alive and among us. After gaining all of that understanding, we're left now with the final what now question. We've seen all the elements that were presented. We know the history, we know the traditions, and we see how things have presented now. So what now? In this section, we address that question of what now? We address the healing aspect of returning to a place of balance. In my language, we call it hojo. And in this area of balance and a return to tradition, that's where we see the real healing begin. This section is geared towards institutions who work with Indigenous populations, who create legislation relating to Indigenous populations, to provide them with an understanding of how colonization progressed through history, so that we do not repeat the same mistakes. In this section, we discuss options such as land back, a movement that has gained a lot of traction in the past few years, where Indigenous people are fighting to preserve their sacred lands and also to have their land back that was stolen. It's important to recognize that all of us are residing on stolen land. And that's the basis of the land back movement. Other options that directly relate to institutions that work with or service Indigenous populations is having an understanding that capitalism, which we all work under, is a system that propagates colonialism. There's no way around it. In order to truly heal and allow for Indigenous people to return to that state of tradition and balance and healing, the demolishment of capitalism ideologies, as well as the return of stolen land, are really the two main ways that we can begin the healing process for Indigenous communities. It is a big picture look. It can happen, but it may not happen right away. So we move on to another section of things that we can do now. Things that institutions and agencies and individuals who service Indigenous communities can do now to help begin the healing process and help stop the onset of colonization within Indigenous communities. We talk about sovereignty and gaining cultural competency when working with Indigenous populations. We discuss decolonization of ideologies within tribes, because the only true way that tribal nations can heal is to decolonize and return to tradition. Now, with all of that being said, and the discussion of my final compendium, all of its contents, and answering the final question, what do we do now? We can begin to examine it going forward in a more in-depth style and really see all of the work that was put in to understanding each of these concepts, explaining them, and tying them together. While I did put together this entire compendium, I didn't do it alone. I discussed with people who were with other Indigenous people along the way. I checked traditions with them to make sure that I was accurate in my representation, especially with those traditions that do not belong to my own tribe. I spoke with people, got their narratives, and gained insight to their lived experience as Indigenous people. I fact-checked and did extensive research for different topics in order to relate theories and ideas to each other in order to create this cohesive unit and this cohesive final compendium. So as you read this, just know that yes, this is all of my own original work, but I did have my community help me to make sure that I am bringing the most accurate and up-to-date information for you to read, enjoy, and understand. Thank you, and I hope you continue to enjoy.